Hello, welcome to the refresher course by Nalsar University of Law. I'm here with you on a session which is asking whether there is any relevance of ITM oral cultures for enabling academic competencies and engagement. Now, before we start off, I think it's required for us to understand what we mean by ITM. ITM stands for Indigenized, Tribal, Minority and Minoritized Communities. Professor Toves Kutnap-Kangas and Robert Dunbar point out at the kind of processes, procedures and a whole range of discourses that come into existence dominantly from the nation states or from supranational institutions which actually create a category of people called as minority itself. So for want of a better expression to refer to people coming from the minorities, I use the word ITM here. One of the fundamental questions that we need to be asking with respect to this particular session is, what do we see language in any educational policy as? A whole lot of theorization exists which looks at language either as a problem, in which case the state has to take measures to remediate it. It is also seen as a resource, so in which case the state has to take measures to see how it can be worked out as a resource, and in some cases it is seen as a right, so the state has to make sure that the right is given to its users. I am proposing a fourth version which I call as language as a cognitive tool. For me, as a teacher and as somebody with a with a critical literacy background, I look at language as a tool for enabling meaning making and meaning coding. It is a tool that helps you make sense of the world on one hand. It helps you also to make meaningful connections with the world on the other hand. And in another dimension, it helps you to codify what you think is meaning. Hence, in this session, we are asking three distinct questions. Question number one would be, can we see ITM people's language and languaging as a distinct way of looking at the world? A worldview of its own. Two, can we ask the question of whether ITM people's languages have a relevance in the academic space? And three, what happens when ITM people's language is brought into the classroom or not brought into the classroom? Both the ways. So for the first question, ITM people's languages, languaging practices, another way of looking at the world itself. Like I was telling, we look at their languages either as a right or as a resource or as a problem. Therefore, the way of looking at it as a cognitive tool has not become as prominent as it should ideally have become. In a way, we are all looking at their languages as from a very deficit perspective. A deficit perspective works in many ways and in many different ways in different domains of the state itself. I'm looking at it as how it works in a classroom space. Coming from a deficit perspective would mean that we begin to attribute any failure on the child's part in the academic space either to the child, his psychology, to his cultures, his parenting styles, his community's languaging aspects. We all know very clearly, at least in the Indian context, that ITM communities are very rich and diverse in their cultural expressions. The kind of paintings they come up with, the colors, the music, the dance, the oral structuring, the oral stories that they have, the tongue twisters that some communities have are amazing. Yet we look at their relevance in the classroom from a very deficit perspective. So that is exactly what we are trying to deal with in the first case study itself. So I am bringing forward to you the case study of the Pirahas. Piraha are a small tribe of about 390 people odd in the southern part of America, the South America, the Brazil. And Professor Daniel Everett's research with the language and the languaging style comes up with a whole lot of comparative structures. One of the comparative structure that is particularly interesting to me and probably even to Professor Gordon was the fact that they do not have numbers. So the Piraha are a language which have just one expression called as hoi, which they use to express one as well as small. So small in number is also hoi and small in quantity is also hoi. Now what does it mean to say that they do not have numbers? It means they do not have counting system like 1, 2, 3, 4, which also implies that they do not have something called as recursion. Recursion is to say 1 is 1, 2 would be 1 and 1 which would be 2, 1, 1, 1 would be 3. So recursion is a process by which you replicate a certain pattern within a single unit. And this does not exist is what the language having no numbers implies. So Peter Gordon went on to do a research with the Pirahas. He spends a full year with them, teaches them to count. He teaches the adults and the children to count, and at the end of a year he does a test. In certain cans he puts batteries and then nuts and asks them to count. He sees that they are not able to count. Because they are not able to count, he concludes that because the Piraha as people without terms for numbers, they do not develop the ability to determine exact numbers. Now, a language is never dead. A language is never static. A language is dynamic and organic in the sense that its people decide what has to be done with its language. So, when the people decide that the language needs to be developed enough to express a research paper in information technology, the terminology and the structures for it will be evolved. So, we never asked whether the Pirahas require a counting system, whether there is a need for the terms and the structures which will represent a counting system, and went on to do what we did exactly with deficit thinking. We said they didn't have the language which counts with terms for counting, and therefore mathematical ability is the least. The second case study that we have is again coming from an ongoing study which is happening right now, where we are looking at the relevance of leveraging cultural practices into the classroom itself. Now, like I was telling you earlier, a lot of stories and story grammars exist with the ITM communities. So, we said we'll ask the children to tell their own stories, and we designed a particular story structure. Our aim was to see whether through stories children are able to come up with something called as causal reasoning. So, we designed a 6-strip picture story which you can see on your screen. The child is supposed to go through these pictures one by one and create a storyline where he is actually going to give us something called as causal reasoning. Causal reasoning links event X with something that caused event X, right? So, we did this. Our previous literature told us that we can expect causal reasoning to happen in the stories, and therefore we came up with a hypothesis. The hypothesis is available for you on the screen. While documenting the stories, we told half of the students to start with their home language, tell the stories in the home language. The other half was asked to tell the stories in their school's language, which in some cases was Hindi and in some other cases it was Telugu. And after 3 months, we repeated the same process, but then in the other language. Now, all of them did with the stories in both the languages. Our hypothesis has been proved that they do come up with different types of reasoning productions. However, something that we did not expect also happened in our data. What happened was that the students didn't stop with the stories structure as per the 6th figure. They went a step ahead and said, look, what the boys have done is wrong. They went on an evaluatory mode and said, we need to get the ball out, but that doesn't mean you have to destroy the snake's home. And they went on to create alternative ways in which the same problem solving could have happened. They went on to create 6 ways in which the ball could be retrieved without actually destroying the snake's home. Why did they go on an problem solving mode when the literature in storytelling does not report it? 1. 2. The second question that is very important, at least for us right now at this stage of research, is that this problem solving mode happened only in their home language and not in Hindi or Telugu. Why again? Questions to be asked, answers we are searching. The third example that we have for you today comes from a math class. My own documentation of the National Achievement Survey starts in 2013. And constantly I have observed that districts of states which are predominantly residential areas of Schedule 5 have always been low on math and low on literacy. So much so that we have documentation saying that way below national average, way below state average. These are expressions that are used. So we began to ask, why is it that these students seem to be scoring low? And we hypothesized that probably there's a literacy factor coming into the play, and 2, there's a language of the test factor that is coming into the play, and therefore these two variables are intervening with math performance itself. So we ask the question, do literacy abilities and language of the test itself impact mathematical competence, performance? And therefore in December 2017, we designed our first test. We pulled out items from NAS and asked the children to do it in exactly the same condition as NAS. You can see the scores on the first table over there. Not much difference between the 4 groups over there. 4 different classrooms in 4 different ITM districts of the country itself. In February 2018, we went back again. This time we designed the same test, the same math NAS test, but then in 4 slightly deviant conditions. We said we are going to give one classroom, condition 2, where we are removing both, we are removing the literacy, giving the math test in oral form. So children listen to the question and respond to the answer, respond to the problem. We did the same thing in the NAS condition, which is condition 1. In condition 3, we said we will remove literacy, but then the language of the test will remain Hindi or Telugu. In condition 4, we said we will give scripted home language, which means we use Devanagari script to write out the same problem in Gondi Bhasha and in Savara, here in Andhra Pradesh. You can see the scores, you can see the time taken to do the test itself. Not only have the scores almost tripled, the time taken has come down at least by 1/3 for all the groups. Why has this happened? Another very interesting fact that we documented in our video recordings was that some children began to do their math on their fingers and in a different way. They didn't do 1, 2, 3 on their math. They had a base count of 20. In one community, it was a base count of 20. And in the other community, it was a base count of 25. So the base count of 25 begins to be called as Paraka. So Paraka became 1 here, which means if there was a number that said 29, so the child would start from 25 here. He would say 25 here and then the 4. So the speed at which the mathematics was being done, the processing was being done, was phenomenally different. If you are the researcher, you can also isolate, single out individual students' performance and see. Interestingly, I found that it was these students who not only scored the highest, but also the least in terms of time taken to do the work. They took the minimum amount of time. Now, our case studies 2 and 3 show us a distinct way in which the findings have come. Why? Why are the findings like this? Well, I think what happened when we asked them to leverage their home language and to count through their home languages was that cognitive engagement in the activity happened. This brings us to the third question, what exactly happens when ITM languages and languaging practices are not leveraged in the classroom space? 1, cognitive engagement does not happen, which means cognitive disengagement starts to trigger in. And when cognitive disengagement triggers in, a whole range of adverse academic and social outcomes are triggered. One of the studies that we engaged with says that when cognitive engagement does not happen, it begins to affect both the physical and the mental health. Instances of bullying, instances of aggression, instances of depression seem to be setting in. We are not trying to advocate a causative link between engagement and the harm that it seems to be mitigating. We are trying to say that there is a link and this link needs to be paid attention to. More importantly, back home in the Indian context, Professor Ajit Mohanty says that in India, especially with children studying in Schedule 5 areas, we are not supposed to ask the question of dropoutism. He wants us to be conscious of something called as mechanisms of push out. How are we through curriculum, our practices, our assessment practices ensuring that an engagement does not happen, which means we are triggering a push out mechanism for the child to be pushed out eventually in the form of a dropout. A very, very recent report called as the Nunavut report comes up with this fact. It documents the Nunavut, the Inuit community to talk about a principle of accumulation of disadvantage. The report says that when academic advantage does not occur for the ITM community, it begins to roll out, take a snowball effect into a whole range of other spaces, including health, including housing, including employment opportunities, and a whole range of other things. Now, in conclusion, what I would like to conclude would be for all of us to ask that in all our discussions on language as right, resource, and problem, Where is the child? Where is the question of child's comfort in communication, child's comfort in comprehending what is happening in the class for him to engage further? Thank you.